is to talk about Till We Have Faces. C.S. Lewis's novel, published in 1956, is one of his last novels, and he thought probably his best. How many people here have read Till We Have Faces? Just as a focus. A few questions, yes, good. Well, you'll be able to contribute to the discussion. If I go too far wrong, maybe just raise a hand, do something to indicate that you'd like to make a contribution. First of all, we're talking about C.S. Lewis in a series of lectures, and we're also talking about Lewis in a series of lectures which takes the relevance of Lewis as its object. I remember in studying Abraham Lincoln, I studied Abraham Lincoln for 5 years and wrote a book about the gentleman. He particularly, even though he was one of the most eloquent of our voices in American history, he did not like to speak extempore. Often there were serenades. Often there were serenades at the White House, and he had the onus of speaking extempore. He had a method of doing it, though. He would rely on Senator so-and-so to say a few well-chosen words, and then General so-and-so to say a few more well-chosen words. And in that sequence of speakers, being the third speaker, he would always say, well, as Senator so-and-so said. I certainly agree. As General so-and-so said, well, we all know his patriotism and work for the Union. I agree with everything that has been said. And now let's hear a few more tunes from the Marine Band. So there is an opportunity that someone has in a sequence of speakers to speak with regard to what has preceded and to build on that. There's a social framework for it. I taught in a program at Villanova. I had to go to a university to teach fourth graders. We always had a final meeting with the parents, and the onus of that was that every speaker had to speak. Well, I always sat at the end of the bench, and it was nice that I was able to summarize things. Although in doing that, there's a wonderful social function that you perform, because you do build upon what has been said before. I did do my homework, and I listened to the speakers before, and Lex McMillan was the only person who actually specifically mentioned Till We Have Faces, but he said two very important things about it, which I'll quote and build on. He said that the reading of Till We Have Faces was very unsettling, and also that it was crucial in his conversion. It was the beginning of his conversion. Now, James Como also did not specifically mention Till We Have Faces, but he mentioned as the major theme of C.S. Lewis's writing the concept of joy. And he quoted C.S. Lewis's statement about joy from the problem of pain, the end of the problem of pain. I've written it up on the board here. Now, Jim, you may remember that, that the Greek letter chi is an X, right? Whoop. And when you have a crossing of phrases, that is called a chiasmus. So when Dr. Como quoted C.S. Lewis on joy, he was quoting a chiasmus. The unsatisfied desire, which is itself more desirable than any satisfaction. Unsatisfied A, desire B, desirable A, right, it crosses, and satisfaction A. In other words, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. In other words, the repeated B is always the emphasis, desirable. I was just talking to a student who was having a lot of trouble in her first year Latin course. And I was trying to encourage her that the problem, this is always the way a teacher is going to speak, that the problem she was having with only seeing the grammatical frames through a glass darkly was in itself a joy. She didn't quite accept that entirely, but I think, though, it's certainly part of our frame as Christians. So Dr. Como's statement, put together with Lex McMillan, sets an interesting frame for what I'm going to say about Till We Have Faces. It is unsettling to read the book, and it talks about the joy, which is basically desirable because it is unsatisfied. Those are two important themes: unsettling, unsatisfied. Do you want to read this book? It's going to bother you, it's going to disturb you, leave you unsettled and unsatisfied, but to see the joy within that in the Christian framework. Also, we're talking about Till We Have Faces and C.S. Lewis in terms of the relevance of Lewis. Now, relevance is a very relative term. When anyone says, this is relevant to me, he better watch out, and you better watch out as well, because he's showing how much he knows or doesn't know. I have a project, because I'm interested in the history of the city of Philadelphia, of reading the newspaper from the 1860s, 1870s. I'm now actually living in, it's February 1884. Forget about what's happening now. It's February 1884. And I find in reading the newspaper, I have a very interesting challenge of the relevant. If I were in the mind of God, I wouldn't have gotten past the first page of the first issue that I ever read, because everything would have been amazingly interesting and relevant. The first name mentioned in the left-hand column would have occupied me endlessly with all sorts of wonderful associations. Well, luckily, blessed be ignorance, because I'm not that smart, I'm not that knowledgeable, that I can see the relevance of everything I'm reading. As I go through the newspaper, I see something about Independence Hall. Well, I know something about Independence Hall, so that's relevant. I see something about Fairmount Park. Oh, yeah. I know something about Fairmount Park, so that's relevant too. I'll make a copy of that article. But in general, though, I'm limited in my own frame on relevance by what I know. What I know is the limitation of what I can see as relevance. Now, C.S. Lewis was not, by his own appointment, an evangelist. He was an apologist. And an apologist has to make things relevant. That's his job. So, in Mere Christianity, for instance, he starts the book by saying, you've often heard people quarreling. What does that have to do with Christianity? Well, C.S. Lewis knows, and as I read that chapter, I thought to myself, because I was teaching that book at Olivet Covenant Presbyterian Church. I did start out as an Episcopalian, leaving the Presbyterians. I thought the Presbyterians were very boring. I realized later that they were actually dignified. Anyway, so I was teaching that book at Olivet Covenant, and as I read that first chapter, I must have taken this from some previous life that I lived. I said, wait a minute, this is the Nicomachean Ethics, Book 5. How did I ever think of that? But anyway, in the Nicomachean Ethics, Book 5, Aristotle does talk about the basis of natural law. And that's the way C.S. Lewis, as an apologist, is getting around to talking about the nature of God and Christianity, because he introduces the frame of natural law. If people quarrel, they must have some point that they think is worth quarreling about. That's the point. But then C.S. Lewis went on to write fiction, and The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, the Narnia Chronicles. All those are the fictional frame by which he felt his Christian apology could be more effective. Now, when I read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I had to blow the dust off some of my knowledge of Victorian furniture to realize that the wardrobe was not what I was wearing over the summer, but it was actually a piece of furniture. But when C.S. Lewis titled Till We Have Faces, I think he got to the most essential quality of what we are concerned about. Because here is what I am bringing to this book in terms of relevance. What I'm saying could be very embarrassing, but I don't think I speak with any particular human focus that you would sympathize with. Personally, I hate looking in the mirror. I hate looking at pictures of myself. I spend my life, Jim, with students who just love to look at pictures of themselves. I sat at my desk and thought, my gosh, why are they taking such joy in seeing pictures of themselves? Well, why, of course, do Americans spend billions of dollars on the cosmetic industry? Because when they do look in the mirror, they can be happy with what they see. So I do not like to see my face. Until We Have Faces is deeply disturbing or deeply moving to me, because it reminds me that I don't know really what I look like. Other people see me, God knows what they think, but eventually I'll look like something, but I'm not quite sure what it will be. We were just reminiscing with some of the, with one of the congregants here about Bradley Cooper. I remember I told Bradley Cooper once, I was his teacher at one point, that if you're good looking at 20, thank God. If you're good looking at 50, thank your character. If you're good looking at 20, thank God. If you're good looking at 50, thank your character. We evolve. And the picture of Dorian Gray is, for me, more than just a metaphor. So I also sometimes make a joke, and this is one thing that I would say, having gone down a few decades, that I don't really understand myself. Therefore, it is certainly impossible for me to think I can understand anybody else. And since I neither understand myself, nor can I really understand anybody else, I certainly can't make any judgments about anybody else. St. Augustine is said in his parlor to have had something written up in gold, and it was simply, don't make judgments. So if anyone at the dinner table was mouthing off about someone, you point up to the rule of the household. This certainly is important, as the one thing I remember distinctly from my reading and teaching of Mere Christianity, the one thing that impressed me particularly in Mere Christianity was C.S. Lewis's statement to that effect: never, never assume you know where someone's going in terms of any ultimate fate. It may be that Hitler is in the bosom of Abraham. I doubt it. But we don't know, and we can't judge where people are going. So-and-so is a good person. He seems to be heading toward his heavenly reward. That's fine. So-and-so seems to be a bad person. But we don't know, and we cannot judge what that person is or where he's going. This is in the mind of God. Until We Have Faces reminds us of this, that we must never make judgments. We must never assume that the face that we see is the face that exists or that God knows. So we have two things here that are interesting before we start to talk about the book itself. That is the unsettling and unsatisfied nature of human life, and the theme of relevance, that I am unsettling to myself. In fact, I'm so unsettling to myself in a way, I really don't need to read this book. I've already done my homework, but that's a long way down the line. I found in teaching it that it was a wonderful, unsettling experience for the students. So, the story of Cupid and Psyche, where does it come from? Or the story of, excuse me, said the answer. Till we have faces. What is the source of the story of Till We Have Faces? It's the story of Cupid and Psyche. I read the story of Cupid and Psyche as a classics major at about age 19. And I'm sure C.S. Lewis probably read it about the same time. The story was already there in his life. He didn't have to think it up. He didn't have to read anything else to get inspired. It was there and probably simmering. It was working into his frames in terms of the thought he had about the spiritual life. So taking it up at the end of his career must have been a wonderful fulfillment for him. The story of Cupid and Psyche is the story, we've all read this story, even though perhaps we haven't specifically read that version. It's the three sisters, the one sister, beautiful, Psyche, the two sisters, not as beautiful, jealous, and Psyche marries Cupid, but marries him under certain special conditions. The conditions are that she can't ever see him in the light. So she's visited by one of her jealous sisters, and in the conversation, the sister realizes that there's a chink in her armor, and that is that she's never seen her husband. Oh. Maybe he's a monster. Never seen him, possibly he's a monster. So she puts that doubt in Psyche's mind, and then Psyche violates the commandment, then is sent out on a series of labors which she must fulfill before she's finally taken up into heaven in sort of an apotheosis, where she's taken up as one of the gods, much like Hercules after his labors. Now, the point of view that C.S. Lewis has taken in Till We Have Faces is much like rewriting Beowulf so that Grendel, the monster, is the narrator. One of the sisters is the narrator of Till We Have Faces. And she's not a jealous, envious, mean-spirited sister. She's a loving sister. She loves Psyche, but loves Psyche with a little bit of a jealous love. So her love, in the end, is almost as destructive as the envy and jealousy of the wicked sister in Cupid and Psyche. I have a friend who once asked me, actually it was Tony Garvin, he said, how much of yourself do you save for friends? Well, I could have quoted Cicero's essay on friendship, in which he said that friendship should be fullness and not lack. Those people who need people are not the luckiest people in the world, because that percentage of need will always be a lack. It will always be an anguish. So in answer to my friend's question, I said, oh, I have 120%. I give my friends the extra 20. In other words, I give them out of my fullness. Of course I was boasting. But boasting with a point, though, in that friendship and love should be out of the fullness of our personalities. It should not be out of our lack. So Orual, the loving sister, the wickedly loving sister, the jealously loving sister of Psyche, is loving through lack and not through fullness. And she can't understand why the gods, why the spiritual powers that be have never given her a clue about Psyche's life. When she visits Psyche, she sees the palace that Psyche lives in only in a momentary vision, and then it's gone. But she doesn't see it. She doesn't see it fully. You see through a glass darkly. St. Augustine described the vision of God as being in a stormy sea and seeing the faint light of a lighthouse on a promontory, on a far promontory. That's the way we we see the ultimate truths of our lives. Not very satisfying, extremely unsettling. But this is the spiritual condition of a Christian. Now, Jim probably assumes that I'm going to quote a little Latin. After all, Jim, how could I talk without doing a little Latin? So I'm going to describe, and this is very understandable, I'm going to describe Orwell's spiritual condition in terms of an Augustinian framework. Intellectual, sorry. Fides quaerens intellectum, much like leonem spina irritat, Jim, subject, verb, object, except it's participle this time. Faith seeking understanding. Faith seeking understanding. I love the challenge of this because this describes our Christian life. Faith seeking understanding. But some of us are a little bit impatient. And Orual writes the book, Till We Have Faces, the fictional writer of the book, as a complaint against the gods, because her faith seeks understanding. And I'm going to add, though, something to this. Said, nunquam inveniens. Faith seeking understanding, but never finding it. Erasmus talked about some arrogant folk who think they have a roadmap to heaven. They think they've found the truth. This is at least not my spiritual condition. So Orual's complaint against the gods is, why hasn't her love worked? Why did the gods begrudge her a full vision of the palace? If she'd seen the palace, she would never have betrayed, so to speak, her sister. But she didn't see the palace save in a short vision. So that the book then is written as a complaint against the gods. And it's written by someone whose faith seeks understanding, but only finds it in the joy of the unsatisfied vision. That's the way Orual feels that she finally sees Psyche and is reunited with Psyche. I'd like to read a couple of passages from the book, but before I do, though, are there any questions from anyone who'd like to ask about the content? I've given a very brief review of the book, but would anyone like to ask some questions about the content? Yes, ma'am.
Could you just say a few things about the grandfather, Fox, his role in all of this?
Yes. I actually, in the passage that I was going to read, she mentions the fox specifically, and I was going to say my teacher. The fox, the fictional, and Lex, maybe you can help me with this, but the fictional mise en scène of the book is somewhere in Armenia, somewhere in the Ukraine. It's somewhere above the Mediterranean basin. Somewhere above the Mediterranean basin. Their concept of Venus is much more primitive. And the fox is a slave who's been captured in one of the wars. And he then is brought up to this very primitive community above the Black Sea. But he teaches the girls, Orual, Relevance, and Psyche, he teaches them Greek. So he introduces the classical framework of Aristotle, Plato. He introduces the concept of the severity of logic and the joy of words. The passage that I would read first talks about that joy of words in what Orual says is a pretty glib statement about how words are virtually self-sufficient to say everything we ever want to say. Does that answer your question a little bit?
Yeah, I guess I haven't finished it this round. I just started it last week, and I'm just trying to figure out if he was overall helpful for Orual. Is that how you say it?
Orual. How do you pronounce it, Lex?
I've never known. I always say Orual.
I remember when I was 12, I would read a book and I'd have my own pronunciation for the characters. At least now, having taught language for 50 years, I think about what the names are. Orual, O-R-U-A-L is her name. Yeah, well, wait a minute.
Well, I'll just keep listening.
Yeah,
I don't care if he was helpful for her.
Yes. You see, faith-seeking understanding, as I was saying, he emphasizes too much the understanding and too little the faith. That's the impediment. He's too rational. Yes, that's basically, yes.
When you talked earlier about being unsettled with yourself, is that to be distinguished from self-loathing?
I hope so. I think in the end, as we evolve and we define and refine our lives, what I may have felt at age 20, I try to get it a little better. I try to focus it a little better. So at age 20, it could have been some sort of self-loathing. Now I'm pretty weary of myself now, but at least I've gotten acquainted. It's like an old friend. He's annoying, but you put up with it. Yes.
Whenever I read a retelling of an earlier story, I like to pay attention to how it's changed.
Yes.
In the original version of Cupid and Psyche, the sisters can see the palace. In fact, going to it and looking at the splendor is one of the reasons they're jealous of Psyche. It's not just her beauty, it's everything that she has. So you've explained a little bit why Lewis took that and just dramatically changed it and had it be an invisible palace, and Orual sees Psyche soaking wet and everything. Says, no, you're not living in a palace, you're living outside, but then has that glimpse of it for a moment. So you explain what that means. That's a significant adjusting of the story for what Lewis was trying to convey.
A little while ago, I learned the difference between jealousy and envy. Jealousy is when my friend John goes on a cool vacation and I'd like to go too. Envy is when John goes on the vacation, I don't want him to go on the vacation and I want to go. In other words, envy is destructive. It's mean. It's mean. So the sisters are envious. They don't want Psyche to live in that palace. They're envious, wickedly envious. Orual is not. Yes. And you see, that's a wonderful rethinking. A wonderful rethinking of the story. Any further questions, just specifically about the content? Okay. I'd like to conclude by reading a couple of passages. And the one, as you were saying, mentions what the fox was saying, and now I can refer specifically to the fox. This is toward the end of the book. She's read out her book. She's read out her complaint against the gods. The complaint was the answer. I've heard myself making it to be answered. Lightly, men talk of saying what they mean. Often, when he was teaching me to write Greek, the fox would say, child, to say the very thing you really mean, the whole of it, nothing more or less, or other than what you really mean, that's the whole art and joy of words. Now, note that C.S. Lewis uses the word joy, put right all the time. It's a terrible pain. A painful joy. A glib saying. When the time comes to you at which you will be forced at last to utter the speech which has lain at the center of your soul for years, you have all that time, idiot-like, been saying over and over, you'll not talk about the joy of words. I saw well why the gods do not speak to us openly, nor let us answer. Till that word can be dug out of us, why should they hear the babble that we think we mean? How can they meet us face to face till we have faces? And then finally, Psyche appears before her in a vision, again, through a glass darkly. She stood before me, holding out something for me to take. Now I know that she was a goddess indeed. Her hands burned me, a painless burning, when they met mine. That air that came from her clothes and limbs and hair was wild and sweet. Youth seemed to come into my breast as I breathed it, and yet, this is hard to say, with all this, even because of all this, she was the old Psyche still, 1,000 times more her very self than she'd been before the offering. For all that then, what flashed out in a glance or a gesture, all that one meant most when one spoke her name was now wholly present, not to be gathered up from hints nor in shreds, not some of it in one moment and yet in another. Goddess, I have never seen a real woman before. The language here is much that Plato uses in the Symposium in the Final Vision. Did I not tell you, Maya, she said, that a day was coming when you and I would meet in my house and no cloud between us? Joy silenced me, and I thought I had now come to the highest, to the utmost fulfillment of being which the human soul can contain. But now, what was this? You have seen the torches grow pale when men open the shutters and broad summer morning shines in on the fretting hall, on the feasting hall. So now, suddenly, from a strange look in Psyche's face, I could see she knew something she had not spoken of, or from a glorious, awful deepening of the blue sky above us, or from a deep breath, like a sigh uttered all round us by invisible lips, or from a deep, doubtful quaking and surmise in my own heart. I knew that all this had been only a preparation. Some far greater matter was upon us. The voices spoke again, but not loud this time. They were awed and trembled. He is coming, they said. The God is coming into his house. The God comes to judge Orual. If Psyche had not held me by the hand, I should have sunk down. She brought me now to the very edge of the pool. The air was growing brighter and brighter about us, as if something had set it on fire. Each breath I drew led me to new terror, joy, overpowering sweetness. I was pierced through and through with the arrows of it. I was being unmade. I was no one. But that's little to say. Rather, Psyche herself was, in a manner, no one. I loved her as I would have thought it impossible to love, and would have died any death for her. And yet, it was not now that she really counted. And yet, it was not now, she that really counted. Or if she counted, I know how gloriously she did, it was for another's sake. The earth and star and sun, all that was or will be existed for her sake, and he was coming for his sake, and he was coming. The most dreadful, the most beautiful, the most dread beauty there is was coming. The pillars on the far side of the pool flushed with his approach. I cast down my eyes. Two figures, reflections, their feet to Psyche's feet and mine, stood downward in the water. But whose were they? Two Psyches, one clothed, the other naked, yet both Psyches, both beautiful, if that mattered now. All beautiful beyond imagining, yet not exactly the same. You also are Psyche, came a great voice. With that, she collapses in her vision, and she So what we have here in this book, and Augustinian frame is useful. When St. Augustine talks about love in the Confessions, he mentions that when his mother was alive, he loved his mother, but when she died, he loved motherhood. In other words, the evolution of our loves go from the physical to the spiritual, so that we are attached at first to our families and to our friends, but we realize in the end that the ultimate face is not, as she realizes, not the face of Psyche, not her face, but one face, as we see it.